We are improvising with some audio difficulties, so forgive us. So I'm Austin, this is Emily. Collectively, we are learning the band. My background is in environmental advocacy, and I think that climate change is definitely an issue of war and peace. The quadrennial report from the Department of Defense says that climate change is a huge national security threat. So apart from the importance to our species, to our planet, it's also to our own well-being, because climate change is a threat multiplier. It will cause more wars over resources, a larger refugee crisis, and greater violence. So I see a big connection there. I'm happy to support this event to try to raise awareness about the issue of peace in 2024. So we're going to play a couple songs that are linked to peace. This first one is by Cat Stevens. So if you want to sing out, sing out. There's a million ways to be, you know that. And if you wanna live high, live high. And if you wanna live low, live low. 'Cause there's a million ways to go, you know that there are. You can do what you want. The opportunities are. Find a new way. Well, you can do it today. You can make it all true. And you can make it until you see. We actually never rehearsed that one before. That was the first time we tried it. We were thinking we would only do one song when we came up this time, but someone said two, so we kind of improvised. That would sound good. Alright, So this next one is one that I'm sure you all know. It's by John Lennon, one of the greatest peace activists in the world.
You're gonna get so young.
We're called Journey. You can check us out online. We're on Facebook, Instagram. Give us a follow. Thanks for listening.
Good morning, friends. I'm on the board, and I'm here today to present the Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award. And this is an award that's given annually to recognize outstanding peacemaking work. It is so named in honor of the memory of our affiliate's beloved founding organizer, Dorothy Daggett Eldridge. Kathy Kelly, this year's award, has repeatedly stood up for peace and human rights both here in the U.S. and around the world. She is founder and co-organizer of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, a campaign to end U.S. military and economic warfare. She has journeyed to war zones of Afghanistan, Iraq, Gaza, Lebanon, Bosnia, Nicaragua. Traveling to Iraq 27 times, she defied U.S. economic sanctions to bring needed medicine to families Voices for Creative Nonviolence have been leading delegations to Afghanistan to make contacts with grassroots peace movements and to learn firsthand from people experiencing the results of U.S. military and economic interventions. She has protested drone warfare outside military bases throughout the U.S. and was part of an aid flotilla seeking to break Israel's siege of Gaza. She has been arrested for civil disobedience numerous times, including during a Black Lives Matter protest over the shooting of Jamal Clark by police, and for participating in a mock funeral in the Capitol Rotunda for protesting torture deaths of Guantanamo prisoners. Kathy has gone to jail for planting corn at a nuclear missile silo near Kansas, and she was sent to Peking prison for leading a protest at the School of Americas. Since 2017, she has participated in fasts and vigils in New York near the UN headquarters to draw attention to the mass starvation in Yemen. Kathy has twice been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She has published numerous articles, as well as her book, Other Lands Have Dreams, From Baghdad to Peking Prison. It is my great honor to present on behalf of New Jersey Peace Action the 2019 Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award to Ms. Kathy Keller.
Well, thank you to all of you. It's been a wonderful privilege to be here with you. I'm grateful that Jeff contacted me some time ago, and for all of the organizing that went into today. It's certainly been a joy to enjoy all of your hospitality, but very especially to Maureen and to Jim. Thank you for having me at your home. And I want to say that when I was a much younger peace activist, I knew some people that were part of the freedom rides and the civil rights activism, and they would come to visit us. Being in Chicago is kind of good for being a hub. And I once asked one of them, Ernest Brown, I said, well, don't you ever feel fear? And he crossed his long legs and his arms and he said, oh my dear, don't ever let anybody tell you they don't feel fear. And then his friend, Maurice McCracken, said, well, Ernie, I reckon that maybe courage is the ability to control your fears. And I think that's true. Courage is the ability to control our fears, and we catch courage from one another, and we live in such a complex time. So I'd like to try to sort through some of the ideas about that complexity. Isn't it a little bit as though we're always putting out brush wars? You know, you just think maybe this war is tamped down, and then Code Pink is at the Venezuelan embassy trying to prevent a coup in Venezuela. It seems like any time you turn around, will it be Iran? And the ongoing consequences of war and the collateral consequences of a war against impoverished people. In our country, I'm speaking about mass incarceration. Yes, John, we have to connect those issues, thank you. We have to connect the gun violence and the nuclear violence and recognize that we can't have a rational discussion about solving the very real problems you face in your neighborhoods, we face in Chicago. We can't have a rational discussion about it unless we figure out how to dismantle what the Reverend Dr. King called the demonic suction cup, the military. So it wasn't too long after I asked Ernest about feeling fear that I asked him, blind as he was, to show me how to plant corn. Because I'm a city person, I never planted anything. And so there was Ernie, big tall Ernest, down on the ground, showing me, reasonably how to plant corn. And then not too long after that, I was out in the missile silo fields of Missouri, where we had determined to plant corn on top of nuclear missile silo sites. And so I just want to briefly recall with you a scene from that day. My heart was thudding, boom, 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 because I was afraid I wouldn't make it over the barbed wire fence. You know, maybe I'll be impaled on top of this fence. And I had said, oh, I can go out to a missile silo by myself. I'll be fine. Well, I calmed down and I planted my 6 pellets of pink corn and maybe hung a banner and then went and sat on top of the lid to wait and see what would happen. And what happened came very quickly. Along came an armored personnel sort of vehicle with a machine gun mounted on top, and it skidded to a stop, and out came 6 men in full military garb and walkie-talkies and rifles, and one said, all personnel, please clear the site. I was going to do whatever they said, and they had the key, so I didn't have to climb the fence again. And I was handcuffed and knelt on the ground, and one soldier kind of had a gun, I mean, not on my head, but in my direction, and the other 3 took off. Maybe to go see what does chapter 2 of the manual say to do next, but here's this fellow with me, and I'm a bit preternaturally extroverted, so I lasted about 1.5 minutes in silence, and then I just started telling him why we were doing what we were doing, and that we cared about children in his family as well as children in the then Soviet Union. And then I asked him, do you think the corn will grow? And he said, I don't know, ma'am, but I sure hope so. So I said, would you like to say a prayer? Yes, ma'am. So I started to St. Francis, peace to our Lord, and a channel of your peace. Where there is darkness, let me so light. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, joy. Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be pardoned as to pardon, to be loved as to love with all my soul. And then he said, amen. And then he came over in front of me. I can't tell you exactly what happened because I never really turned around. But he asked me, ma'am, would you like a drink of water? And I said, oh, yes, please. And then he said, ma'am, please tip your head back. And I did, and I can still feel that water dribbling down my chin. Because that young man, that soldier, whose job is to protect the nuclear weapon underneath us, an intercontinental ballistic missile, and he's supposed to be guarding it, he decided that he would really rather help Ma'am out, and with his canteen squeeze it and pour water down my throat. I don't know what he did with the gun, but I know he didn't have it in his hands. And so I asked you just to stay with me on that young man's question a little bit longer. Ma'am, would you like a drink of water? Because what if we could say to the children of Yemen, facing now a 3rd round of poison, impossible water, children, 85,700 of them, save the children tells us, have already died from starvation and disease caused by war. If we could say to those children, we care more about you than we could ever care about these weapons, would you like a drink of water? And my friends, bring it closer to home. I'm from the Midwest. Let me just look into Flint, Michigan, where the water is poisoned with lead. And if we could say to the children in Flint, Michigan, would you like a drink of water? And to our younger generations who anticipate bringing children into this world, a future world, if we could say we care a lot more about ensuring that the earth can supply clean water and clean air and clean ground. If we could say to the future generations, would you like a drink of water? But very, very powerful groups, it sometimes almost seems like they conspire, don't want us to see the choices in those stark fashions. And then when we see the choices, we make reasonable, rational decisions. And so in my gratitude to all of you, because you've been doing that, and you will be doing that, I'd like to do something that Voices for Creative Nonviolence, the group I'm with, has tried to do over time. Thank you for that introduction, Maureen. One of the things that we've learned is that where you stand determines what you see. I got a year in maximum security prison for planting that corn, and that was my best, most educational year since I was 5 years old. Where you stand determines what you see. I began to understand in a way I never could have before the collateral consequences of our wicked mass incarceration system. But also when I've been in war zones and when the bombs are falling, when you're with mothers with infants in their arms, when you recognize the consequences of economic wars, maybe being in a pediatric war that becomes like a death row for infants because the mothers will never go home, you begin to see with a different perspective. There is, I would submit, no way that Saudi Arabia is going to let human rights activists and peace activists into Yemen to try to stand alongside people suffering desperately there. One flight goes into the country of Yemen per week. They're under such a state of siege. Once it will fly from Djibouti, once it will fly from Amman, and the World Food Program organizes that flight. Without the flight, people are in even more desperate conditions, but the Saudis say we vet every passenger on that flight. And I was trying to get visas for Medea Benjamin and me. I tried every day for 3 months. It simply wasn't going to happen. And so we've been trying with many, many other people to pay attention to what's happening in Yemen through the very brave reporting of reporters who are able to get over there. I especially recommend Iona Craig. She's a Muslim woman who grew up in Scotland and was trained as a horse jockey. But she decided to get into journalism. She speaks Arabic and she's done brilliant work. So the first place I'd like to ask you to think about with me is a village called Ahab in a remote rural area of Yemen. And the villagers in Ahab were suffering the fear and the reality connected to the fact that the water table was going down, down, down. And without water, who can live? And they realized that the fuel subsidies were no longer coming in, that they were in more and more desperate shape, and the government wasn't going to help them. They weren't going to get help from any insurgent group, so they started to look to each other. What can we do? And they decided to form a cooperative and to each give what they could. And fortunately, one person happened to have a little bit more and dug down a little bit deeper, and they acquired a rig to drill for water. And they were drilling, no water, drilling, no water. And then finally, one afternoon, they hit water, and the celebration that evening was joyful. They were dancing, they were singing, and that same, evening and the following morning, when the celebration was breaking up, a Saudi warplane carrying a Raytheon manufactured weapon flew over that remote rural village, and the bomb that they dropped when it exploded sent shards flying 8 times faster than the speed of sound. And people were decapitated and maimed. And the next morning, villagers, curious what was going on out there at night, came out. People hoping to find their loved ones came out. And then, people can't always grab the children back, and the children are curious. So there were about 100 people gathered the following morning, and the planes came back. And boys were driving into the cornfields, and the villagers were trying to run as fast as they could. And some survivors said it was almost as though these warplanes, and remember they get their surveillance assistance from the United States, and at that point they were being refueled by United States planes, and that's why the plane could fly out and then come back in the same, quote, operation. There were no hospitals nearby. 32 people were killed and dozens more maimed. And so the villagers of Ahab had something to teach us about cooperative living. The second village I'd like to return to, in a sense, is in 2017, a village called Al-Khayal. And I'll just say to you, I haven't had a television since I was 17. Maureen asked me if I wanted to watch TV this morning, and I was shocked. And so, I thought,
some of you won't get this, but I thought Farrah Fawcett was a plumbing company. I know. Empty. But I had to give a talk at Manhattan College, and Mary House Catholic worker, and I thought, well, I better get this right. So I watched President Trump give his first speech to both the Senate and the Congress, and I was kind of stunned, really. The next day, in fact, I couldn't get out of bed. I was just flattened. I'd never seen the man. I'd never heard him speak, So in that talk, he did what most presidents do. He had in the gallery somebody whose emotional situation would speak to what he wanted to promote. That's standard. But in this case, he had the bereaved widow of a man who had just a week previously been killed as a Navy SEAL in the line of duty. And this woman, arms aching for a loved one who will never return, was focused on as the president named her, and she was the former wife of Chief Petty Officer Navy SEAL Ryan Owen. And all of the people, the senators, the Congress people, gave her a 4-minute standing ovation. And 4 minutes can be a long time to have, national TV focused on you. And she was shaking and she was trembling and looking upward. And the president was shouting, he'll never be forgotten. He's up above. He's looking down on you. Well, at no point was there ever any mention of where Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen was killed. He was killed in Yemen, in the remote village Al-Hayat. And you see, the United States Navy SEALs, some of the best trained warriors in the world, can go anywhere if the United States designates this place as a place that's part of the Great War on Terror. And Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula was said to be operating in this particular part of Yemen. And so they had done what's called a night raid, and it's something that they've done so many times it must almost seem rote. They come in and break into a household, sometimes throw a grenade over the wall, and then the householders are hogtied, and women are all put into one room, others are handcuffed, and if anybody puts up any kind of fuss, they could be imprisoned, they could be killed. And then they systematically rip open the mattresses, go through the closets, dump out the drawers. Well, while they were doing this, the other people in the neighborhood came running. And they tend to have weapons. And so the helicopter the Navy SEALs had arrived in was disabled, not going anywhere. And so the Navy SEALs had called in air support. At some point in that process, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen was killed. It might have been a grenade that had hit him. Well, in one small hovel, a woman, 30 years of age, Fahim Mohsen, with her sister and collectively their 12 children, were huddled. It's the middle of the night. They have no idea what's going on. And all of a sudden, the air support had come and sent a missile flying into their home. And so they survived. They're terrified. She's not sure what to do. And how could she know that if she goes outside, the heat sensors can pick up her presence? And so she had to decide to stay in or go out into the night. She chose the latter. She had her infant in her crooked elbow. She had her 5-year-old's hand in hers. And Fahim Mohsen was going to go out and usher the others, hopefully, to safety. And as soon as she stepped outside, her 5-year-old son was the witness. She had taken just a few steps, and she took a fatal bullet in the back of her head, shot from a helicopter gunship. The 5-year-old and the baby survived. The baby just grew the graze on its forehead. But that night that Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen was killed, there were 26 Yemenis from the village killed. And 10 of them were children under 13 years of age, and 6 were mothers. And so the people of Al-Hayat, that somehow we have an exceptional right to consume more of the world's resources and take whatever we want, whenever we want. And that our lives are worth more than other lives.
More recently, 2019, a little over a month ago, people in the village, again in Yemen, called Keynote, were going to a hospital that's been funded by Save the Children. And the hospital in Keynote was bustling in the early morning. People were going to their jobs, they were congregating in the waiting room, and all of a sudden the hospital was chosen as a site for the Saudis to fire, again, a radiation bomb, and 7 people were killed, 4 of them children. Probably the saddest tweet I've ever read came from Doctors Without Borders, after their Doctors Without Borders hospital had been bombed in Yemen, and previously their hospital in Afghanistan had been bombed, and several other clinics and a cholera treatment center had been bombed in Yemen. They asked, is bombing hospitals the new norm? Well, Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations at the time when the Saudis had first bombed the Doctors Without Borders hospital, said to General Assiri, whose name you might have heard in connection with Jamal Khashoggi's death, he said, you can't be bombing hospitals. And Brigadier General Assiri from Saudi Arabia said, well, we'll consult with our American partners for better advice about targeting. Well, so I have O negative blood. And the doctors in Afghanistan at the Italian Surgical Center for Victims of War are always glad to see me because I can give blood that can be used for whoever needs it. And so I was donating blood in Afghanistan with some of my young friends, and I asked the doctors in the Italian hospital, is there anybody here still who was a survivor of the bombing of the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz? And the Italian doctor said, oh, yeah, you go talk to this guy, it's so lonely. So my young friends went, and they could speak one another's language, and they kept on helping me understand what had happened. And this young boy had been in the hospital, a student pharmacist. And his mother had said, don't go to work today, it's too dangerous. But he had said, Mom, it's a hospital, they're not going to bomb a hospital. Well, the United States that day had begun an attack at 1 o'clock in the morning that went on for 3.5 hours, even after the hospital authorities and the United Nations and Doctors Without Borders had notified the U.S. military, the Afghan military, and NATO, you are bombing a hospital. They nevertheless circled around with a C-135 transport with Bofors cannons and Gatling guns mounted on it, and they kept on firing incendiary devices. The ICU was in flames, the emergency room was in flames. The 2 pharmacists were utterly terrified when they had come upstairs. They'd already disabled their cell phones because they did know that somehow these aerial planes could do tracking and drones could be involved and they could be identified. And so as they watched patients whom they'd been treating afire in their own beds, and as the ceiling fell in on patients in the intensive care unit, they had to make a run for it to save their own lives. The chief pharmacist went first. Khalid's heart was pounding. It's his turn. The security people said, look, man, make a run for it. He ran as fast as he could, got 1 foot outside the gate, and then took shrapnel in his back, fell to the ground. He was bleeding to death, losing consciousness. Half his body was paralyzed, and he'd already taken apart his cell phone. But Afghan tradition says if you can reach your father when you are near your death, tell your father you were sorry for anything you ever did to hurt him or your family. So Khalid managed to get the battery out, put the cell phone back together again, reached his father, and fortunately for him, the father said, my son, take your vest, put it underneath your back, it will stop the bleeding. And he had rolled himself into a ditch, told his father exactly where he was near the hospital entrance. Relatives sped over there as fast as they could. They found his body. They found a body bag. They put him in the body bag more or less as a stretcher. And Khalid came to long enough to say, I'm not dead.
And indeed, he survived. When I met him, he had an internal catheter, he had an IV, he was sallow in complexion, his bones were protruding, but he survived. And I think he maybe had some survivor's guilt when he realized I was from the United States. He told me that that day 42 people had been killed. 13 of them were hospital staff, 3 were doctors. And then he asked, why did your people want to do this to us? We were only trying to help people. We were only trying to help people. And so we can learn from the villagers who are trying to help people. And we can do it. We can do it all with that $750 billion that's going toward military spending. We can solve the problems even of climate catastrophe, or at least begin to make a dent. But we can't do it if we continue to let fear drive us into saying, well, don't rock the boat. And now I want to be careful, because I know we've got younger people here, and it is a different ballgame now. I want to acknowledge that, so be careful. But, I don't know, maybe this will help. I was protesting at the School of the Americas. I had just gotten out of the shock and awe experience of bombing, and had been in Iraq, 27 times trying to break the economic sanctions. And I just thought, I can't be at liberty in this country. Show me a line and I'll cross it. So School of the Americas, that was fine. I crossed the line, and it wasn't like it was my first season out. I sort of know how to do this. In fact, for me, going through security is a bit like going through, TSA, pre-check almost, or whatever they're doing at the airports. And so I was doing what I was told. I was handcuffed, and they snapped the handcuffs. We were in a room about twice this size. There were 25 stations, because many people were being arrested that day. I was one of the youngest. Many were priests and nuns, people I've admired for a long time. But it was the most pushing, shoving, hands inside of clothing, squeezing, screaming arrest situation I'd ever experienced. And so the high school study teacher and me came out. Somebody was screaming at me, raise your arms, spread your legs, raise your arms higher, spread your legs further. I said, could you help me understand why you're screaming at me? Don't say anything, keep your eyes on the soldier in front of you, spread your arms. And so I thought of Ernest really, and the freedom riders and my mentors. And I thought, I can't go along with this. So I very quietly said, I'm sorry, but I can't cooperate with this anymore. Boom! I was down on the floor, I had a slight black eye from the impact. My wrists were cuffed, my ankles were cuffed, my wrists and ankles were then cuffed together. They call it hogtie. And a soldier about Jeff Hoey's size is kneeling on me, calling me the F word. And I couldn't breathe. And so I thought, well, I better say something. I might lose consciousness. And so that was kind of embarrassing. I said, excuse me, but they're hurting me. I can't breathe. Nothing. This guy is still on top of me with his knee. And so I thought, I have to say something again. And I again said, this really hurts. Nothing. Well, in the past, I've had 4 lung collapses due to congenital diseased tissue covering half of one lung and 3/4 of the other. And actually, my lungs are glued up. They're not going to fall down, but in a pinch. So I said, I've had 4 lung collapses, and I can't breathe. Well, they didn't want a dead pacifist on their hands, I think. And so the person kneeling on me got up. And then, now this part is pretty important for this story, I think. They had to take my picture, but, I look like a shaggy dog. The hair is in front of my face. You can't see my face, so how are you going to take my picture? And I'm handcuffed, and I've been carried around hogtied, so when they got me propped up upright and they want to take my picture, they realized, well, she can't move her hair. So one of the other young soldiers very gently asked, ma'am, would it be all right if I moved the hair from in front of your face? And I said, oh yeah, that's fine. And then ever so gently, he moved the hair from in front of my face and then squeezed my shoulder. I know those cuffs are real tight, ma'am, he said. We're going to get them off of you as soon as we can. Well, I needed that. it sort of made me realize we're all human. But my friends, Eric Garner was on the ground, and the New York police were kneeing him, just as had happened to me, but he wasn't one, was he? And he said, I can't breathe. And he placed his hope that the person kneeling on him would get up. And so the complications. So the woman who founded Save the Children, this is way back. Her name was Eglantine Jebb, J-E-B-B. And she knew about a committee which was saying, look, World War I has ended, but because of blockades, people in Germany and in Austria can't feed their children. We're starving children. And so she thought, well, that's not right. And she got a flyer together, and the flyer said, stop starving children. Now, this was the end of World War I, and she's down in Trafalgar Square with her flyer saying they've got to lift the blockade against Austria and Germany. And so she was arrested. This is treasonous. And she was convicted. And she was fined. But the judge in her case paid the fine. And that became one of the first contributions to the organization, Save the Children. And throughout her life, Eglantine Jebb constantly insisted every war is a war against children. And I think we need to add, every war is a war against Mother Earth. And so I think about Barbara Deming, someone who was one of the civil rights activists as well. And her kind of iconic line, I suppose, was, we are all part of one another. That we could reach a point where everybody will say, we can't breathe. You know, my friend Steve Kelly is a Jesuit priest, and he's been for a year now, along with Mark Colville and Liz McAllister, in the Glynn County Jail in Georgia because of an action, a plowshares action, at the nuclear missile station, naval station in Kings Bay, Georgia. And all they can send out are postcards. Think of the tiniest index card you've ever used. They're pre-stamped postcards, and that's all they can receive, it's all they can send. But every time I get one, about once every 2 weeks, from Steve Kelly, we're no relation, he always addresses me as Kathy of Kellydom Midwest. And that's how he really believes the map to be organized. He does not give a rat's whatever about the 1%, powers that be, organizers of borders. That's not how he sees the world. He's, he's Thomas Paine, my country is the world, my religion is to do good. And so I want to think about, the 1,125 Hiroshimas loaded on every single Trident submarine. We could so easily create a world where every species, although some can't speak any kind of a language as we do, but every species would collectively be saying we can't breathe. And so our need to recognize, locked in winter, summer lies. Gather your bones together. Rise. Rise to the occasion. Rise to the possibility. Rise to the chance. It's such a good chance. There can't be anything more worthwhile in our lives than to say we're going to save the earth. Thank you very much.
Questions from you. We ask that you come up to the side of the stage. We'll get a microphone down here. And I know we're over time as usual. Let's see how many questions we can fit in here. Okay. Anyone with a question, they can come up here to the microphone.
Question and answer.
Baker?
I have a question because, you know, these sorts of stories, I listen to NPR every day. I'm a contributor. You know that 70% of their contributions come from Stephen Harvey Goldstein's. And yet I've never heard of Steve there. Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, Naomi Klein. I think it's time we go to NPR and say our voices need to be heard. Or we don't it's all I'm saying.
Put that in the form of a question, do you think?
Listen to WBAI.
Thinking,
Do you ever get tired?
oh,
How do you maintain the passion?
you know, I've been incredibly lucky in life. I used to be a high school teacher, and I think that kind of gets you in the mode in some ways. Forget the weekends to yourself. But I really mean it about catching courage from one another and overcoming fears. I also, you know, I think I've been entrusted with some questions that people in other parts of the world have asked, like Khalid Ahmed's, you know, why would you people want to do this to us? And there's this sense of, you know, if there's an Iraqi mother sitting cross-legged on a bed holding an infant, and the English nurse has just said to you, I think I understand it's a death row for infants, and you know that the Iraqi mother isn't going to be able to get on NPR, and you're not going to be able to get on NPR, but still I can do a little bit of raising a voice, perhaps. And so it seems like, you know, we're each just a drop in the ocean in terms of all the myriad life, you know, going backwards and forwards, and now, so to do one's ocean's drop's worth seems pretty important. I hope it's okay if I just toss in something. You know, I never look at my notes because I can't see them. But, but I did want to tell, along this line of fear and surveillance in our world today. You know, if you are in Kabul, Afghanistan, and anytime you step out, I just came back in February, you look up and you see a big, huge blimp flying over Kabul. And there are 4 of them. I don't even know if the cameras are turned on, but it's constantly sending a message, we're watching you. I was in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead. That was a terrible, terrible bombing, like from 11 till 1 at night. And then again from 3 till 6 in the morning. Once every 11 minutes, a bomb exploded. And I mean, I don't know anything about ballistics, but pretty soon I could tell, ooh, that was a Hellfire missile fired by an Apache helicopter. And that was a 500-pound bomb dropped by an F-15. And you know how I got to know the difference in those sounds? The children taught it to me. So there's a ceasefire, and the children can't wait to go outside, and you know, I'm being pulled outdoors, and they wanted to collect firewood, twigs, and you know, bush, like tumbleweed almost, because they wanted to help their parents. And I've seen that again and again in war zones. The kids just want to help their parents because they know their parents were really, really worried and fraught. And of course, there's no electricity in Gaza, and how are they going to even boil water? And so the kids had a tarp, and they were putting this fuel on the tarp. And a fellow, maybe late mid-years, came up to me, and he said, because they were sitting around a kind of a garbage can fire, he and a couple other men. He said, you're probably wondering why we don't help those children, huh? And I said, no, and please enjoy your tea. And he said, looked up, he said, well, you know, if I pick up a branch up above, they might think that I've got a gun. and those children and you and I could be killed. And that's what this kind of surveillance gets us. You know, it's proliferating. I mean, the Houthi rebels have drones now. Don't kid ourselves. This technology is going, and so this advanced technology capacity to track, I think it can create more fear. And that's the last thing in the world we need. You know, we need to be able to say, look, we've got other priorities. You know, I really hand it to Medea Benjamin. She just walks right up to the microphone at some event for Venezuela's, coup leaders and takes over the mic and starts very rationally speaking to people. This is the kind of thing that I think tilts us in a direction that we need. Also, you know, you see Black Lives Matter. As I said, those youngsters are being hit with pepper spray. They're being put in really difficult jail situations. There's been torture of prisoners in county jails where I come from in Chicago. So part of the complication we face is to ask, what's the wisest way to use our resources, knowing that many of us have had enormous privileges. Like no one in the world in human history has had this level of comfort. And we haven't faced, at least so far, huge fears that my neighbors or my relatives might be disappeared if I speak up. Now, I'm not speaking for everybody, but that has often been kind of the norm. So what risks are we willing to take that begin to be commensurate to the risks that the planet faces? These are big, hard, complicated questions, and we have to address them together. Because, oh my goodness, I didn't look to that. Thank you.
First of all, I think the traveling you do and the time you spend with people in war-torn areas is invaluable and indispensable, because people like you are the only way people like us get to hear what's actually going on, and then we can relate to the people who are on the other end of the bombing and say we wouldn't want that to happen to us or where we are. So I commend you, and I think let's have another round of applause. I was speaking earlier, you asked me to remind you to say something if you didn't. And so I want you started to touch on it with your stories from Gaza. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about the flotilla that you said you were going to try to organize from Chicago. Okay.
Won't you please come to Chicago? Yeah, Chicago this summer, July 20th. Who can say no to Anne Wright? Not me. So Anne has been organizing international flotillas, and I was with her on one of those efforts, but on the year when they're not doing one internationally, going to Gaza, trying to break the siege of Gaza, they're asking people to do local North American flotillas along waterways. And so Anne was thinking about beautiful Lake Michigan, and I was thinking about, I don't know, a soul even owns a boat or rides on a boat, what? But then we thought, oh, well, we know people with kayaks and canoes and rowboats, and now I'm saying bring your own bathtub. But please come to Chicago July 20th and down the Chicago River, which goes under some beautiful bridges with terrific architecture. We'll have a free Gaza flotilla. Gazans are under siege. We'll set up a mock jail, because it's like the world's largest open-air prison. And instead of sending money to the people who are purchasing, storing, selling, using weapons, and that's certainly among many governments, the government of Israel and its persecution of Gazans, we should be using those resources to free everybody that's locked up in our prisons from the wrongfulness, the collateral consequences, and the wrongfulness of the mass incarceration system in this country. So please come to Chicago if you want to be part of the protest. And you can be with me and be a landlubber up on the bridge.
I told Kathy that we should do one on the Hudson. My question to you, Kathy, is, and some people here have heard me say this before,
thing that frustrates me most is when I talk to people and they say, oh, I agree with you, you're right, but nah, I can't get out there, I don't know what to do. I'm not that kind of person who will go out and demonstrate, vigil, and do all of that. How do we inspire? How do we get people off their rear ends and make them realize that if they're not out there, that we're not going to change anything?
Thank you, Judith. Well, you know, realtors say location, location, location. I think we have to say education, 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 not only through the institutional means of educating, but through other means. And I mean, I am sometimes carrying around 8 half-written letters to the editor. Finish it! So the letter, you know, when you get an idea in your head, you know, write that letter to the editor. When people have a chance to get involved in, you know, mailing, get people in on the mailing level so that it's not the same people always doing the mailings, or bring people in on offering hospitality. You know, I think there are ways of sort of maybe, I don't know, just beginning to open the door that we can enter in through. Especially, you know, sometimes it's just you never know what's going to come around the corner. When President Trump said he was going to ban all Muslims from entering into the United States, every airport just suddenly whoosh, filled up. So I think to keep on recognizing that we could be much closer to the tipping point than we realize. And then, you know, I think everybody in this room should give themselves a pat on the back. We can't calculate exactly where or what influenced people to begin to be part of what's a pretty strong and rising movement with regard to climate catastrophe. We've got a pretty strong and rising movement with regard to immigration. The Black Lives Matter movement has touched people all around the world. You know, and the other thing is the internationalism is so important. Right now there's a democratic uprising in Sudan, and those people that include certainly professors and established people in Sudan are also learning from the young people. And it's brilliant. They've learned from the Arab Spring in 2011. You've got people saying, okay, if there's a little kid here, put the kid on your shoulders so the child can see what's going on. There's going to be a difference between our encampment here and what's outside, because all the trash is picked up here. Yes, we're going to have checkpoints because we don't allow weapons, but they're going to be the nicest checkpoints you ever encountered. Thank you for your service, but you know, as they pat people down, yes. They've got places where people can get their pharmaceuticals if need be. It's just been the most joyful, respectful demonstration of refusal to go along with the warlords. The warlords say, well, you know, we'll have elections in 2 years. They say, no, 4. We want to make sure we build up civil society. The warlords tell them, give us the names of your leaders. They say, we're all leaders. So I think that there's a lot to be seen worldwide. I go over to Afghanistan and, you know, these youngsters, I've got those scarves out there. There's one over there. Maybe Jeff can hold it up for my share. They say on one end, border free, and on the other end, they didn't mix. And you know, the young girls, they make these scarves, but for them, that means that you go up the mountaintop, you do your own surveillance. You do your surveillance by bringing your pad and your pen, and you ask questions of the widows living up on the mountaintop. How many times a week do you eat beans? They never ask about meat, because that's ridiculous. What's your source of water? What do you pay for rent? And who's the main income earner? And if the main income earner is under 13 years of age, that survey goes up to the top of the pile. And then they sort through who is...
and kind of elevator pitch on a level of 1 to 10. What's the hope in your view? Is there a hope for us, for people people elsewhere in Afghanistan, perhaps, or wherever you've been, like literally on the level of 1 to 10?
So I think I'm channeling my inner Chomsky here. The planet will survive, even if we go. It could be, if Mother Earth had a chance to say something. We haven't been great for the planet. What's the hope? There are so many people cradling children who are too weak to cry. If somehow people can hear that whimper anyway, in any way, hear the sound of a child who's too weak to cry, then we will have hope. But we've got to get the tuning, the yearning to be massive. It's happened before. The world has experienced incredible changes. And I think it can happen again, but we may not be the ones to be at the forefront, It's a big world. With 4% of the world's population, 96% of the world includes massive numbers of people who are yearning. It's like a flame burning within them. It'll only be cured by being able to feed their children and have as a norm decency and goodness.
Let's have another round of applause. We're going to have the results of the raffle in just a minute. In the meantime, we want to see you out there as volunteers. Kathy mentioned education. That's one of the most